Hello and welcome to Business Today Television. I'm Siddharth Zarabi and you're watching Easynomics. On the show today, we are taking up the Telecommunication Bill 2023, which the government says will do away with a lot of history that had come up in the telecom laws that date back to 1885 and provide a new framework for India's telecom and digital economy. And joining me to discuss the fine print are experts including Jaideep Ghosh, former partner at KPMG, and Nikhil Pahwa, founder of Media Nama. We'll also be joined by other guests during the show. But before we get on with the views of our guests, let's quickly hear what Communication Minister Ashwini Vaishnaw had to say when this bill was introduced in Parliament.
To introduce the Telecommunication Bill 2023 to amend and consolidate the law relating to development, expansion and operation of telecommunication services and telecommunication networks, assignment of spectrum and for matters connected therewith or incidental thereto. Thank you, Speaker sir.
Jaideep, I'll start with you. This has been in the making for quite some time. There was a version earlier in 2022 and the 2023 one makes changes to that. But what are your key takeaways, the big one as far as this bill is concerned?
Okay, and given where Siddharth, the telecom sector, has been rapidly growing, I think I would take a more encouraging and a positive view in the sense there is some progress in terms of the regulations and vis-a-vis what was earlier tabled last year and this time. As you said, it's replacing legal framework as early as 1885 and as recent, if I may say, recent 1950. And several, if I just give you a quick rundown of for the viewers, the bullet points, it kind of, replaces the word licensing with authorization. And then, government retains lawful interception of messages and communication. Then there's certain guidance on spectrum allocation, spectrum reforming, etc. And then, user protection and safety requirements, biometric, KYC, and then do not disturb registry, etc. So that's kind of also USO, the Universal Services Obligation Fund, which usually is used for creating infrastructure in underserved and unserved areas, that's been renamed as I think Digital Bharat Nidhi and so on and so forth, which are the salient features. I think there is some clarity in some areas. The big one being which was expected was whether OTT, like, whether it is WhatsApp or Zoom or Telegram Signal, that's included or not. Now, there is some clarity and there is some lack of clarity also. And there has been certain clarity on spectrum allocation. So I think by and large, it's a progress and some areas have been covered well and provides a clarity. But then the basic, I am not very clear whether what's the difference between authorization and licensing. To me, looks like any telecom services still needs authorization, and probably it will have terms and conditions which are similar to licensing. And it looks like OTTs are not getting covered, but then the definition of telecom is very broad. So honestly, many things can get covered. I do appreciate the challenge of defining very clearly, because in the convergence economy, what's telecom, what's online, what is what, but those clarity probably will emerge hopefully over a period of time. But definitely is a progress, and we should see some more action on this. Siddharth?
Yeah, that's a good point, and I want to just take one quick follow-up with you before I go to Nikhil. When you talk about the very broad definition of telecommunication, what is your worry or concern with regard to that, specifically with respect to the provisions?
See, I think earlier version, which came sometime last year, was including OTT, which could mean everything and anything, and not only WhatsApp, and Signal, Telegram, Zoom, etc. It could mean, anything, which could be, any of the streaming services and others. So those seem to be clearly out of the purview. This is what I understood from reading. But whether WhatsApp, etc., are completely, beyond the purview of telecommunications bill, and needs to be separately governed by Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. That part I am less clear, because certain services provided by these communication OTTs are fairly similar. While of course they don't have the spectrum, they don't have the tower infrastructure and the other kind of physical infrastructure. So those are issues which really will need more clarity. But by and large, other OTTs seem to be outside the purview of this particular telecommunications bill. The
Uh,
definition of telecom, I
uh,
think, is very broad, includes streaming, includes data
So, so,
communication.
so, the, so very
Here.
quickly, do you think? Are you therefore suggesting that messaging services, let's say for example, Google Pay or even a Zomato, which has some amount of messaging involved, are you saying that they will also have to register and seek an authorization because of the provisions, the way they are worded?
My understanding, and this is my understanding and could be wrong, is that applications which where messaging is an incidental services like Google Pay or Zomato or many others, language learning platform, matrimonial platforms, etc., those are out of the purview. But where the things like messaging and calling, which is these ones, WhatsApp and others, where that's the primary business, seems like there could be a possibility of getting included here, though it's not very clear from the wording. And I do understand the problems of giving a very clear definition of telecom services, because we are living in a convergence world.
Right, right. Nikhil, coming to you, because this was one of the concerns. But what's your own sense to take the point that Jaideep has just mentioned, clause 2P, which says telecommunication means transmission, emission or reception of any messages by wire, radio, optical or other electromagnetic systems, whether or not such messages have been subjected to rearrangement, computation or other process by any means in the course of their transmission, emission or reception. The reason I read this is for our viewers to appreciate how dense sometimes some of these clauses can be, although I must say that the language of this bill is far simpler than many other bills that I have seen in the past. But Nikhil, the big question to you.
Yeah, so Siddharth, I'm going to disagree with Jaideep on the fact that there is no clarity that all of these services are covered, because you have to look at the definition of the word message. It says any sign, signal, writing, text, image, sound, video, data stream, intelligence or information sent through telecommunications. Now, this doesn't distinguish between PSTN, which is old traditional telecom, and IP, which is Internet Protocol. So effectively, the definition of message covers all data transfers taking place over telecommunications network, and the telecommunication is basically the transmission of these messages. So whether you look at WhatsApp, you look at streaming, it is true that very specific phrases that were in the 2022 draft, like broadcast, data transfers, etc., they have been removed. But that doesn't mean that the definition of message isn't broad enough to cover everything that is online. And that includes cloud, it includes software as a service, it would include messaging, it would include email. Just a removal of those exact phrases doesn't mean that that doesn't cover. So what is the downstream impact of that? Messaging services and email services will need authorization, and authorization is basically upstream of licensing. Licensing is a form of authorization, and so just like there can be registration as a form of authorization also, we don't know whether there will be registration for online services going forward. But the problem is, if you are not authorized, then you don't have the right to operate. And you can't expect every service in the world to come and get authorized by the Indian government. So I think it's a badly drafted bill, but it's not a mistakenly drafted bill, because this input was actually given by us at Medianama and many others during the consultation process that took place last year, saying that, hey, you're a telecom regulator, you're a telecom ministry, you're trying to encroach onto the internet domain, right? And Siddharth, you and I mean, you've been looking at this domain for over 2 decades now, so you know that one of the things that we've been talking about for many years in telecom is a separation of content from carriage. And so the DOT had this opportunity to bring in a new era of telecommunications by separating access services from online services and other services. And that separation of content and carriage hasn't happened here. And I
Okay.
think that's a mistake, and that's a lost opportunity, because what you have, from at least from a broader standpoint, is you basically modified the three bills, including the Telegraph Act, and made a new bill which broadly does the same thing. Like, so even when it comes to interception, it doesn't really improve the status quo.
Okay.
It might help on the spectrum side, it might help on the telecommunication side, but I think it's regressive to include verifiable biometric authentication as a part of this bill,
Okay.
simply because you can't expect me to do biometric verification to send an email, right? That's ridiculous. But the definitions make it like that. And this is happening after Ashwini Vaishnaw, as a minister for IT as well, has passed a data protection bill that requires verifiable biometric authentication, or consent, for children using the internet. And the industry and the government is struggling to identify what verifiable biometric authentication looks like, and how is it scalable. So to include that in another bill, I think is very is problematic. Like, I really can't put this down
Fair
to
point,
sins
Nikhil.
of omission.
Let's take some of those issues because there's a lot of ground to cover in the time that we have. At this stage, let me also introduce Prashant Singhal, Emerging Markets TMT leader at EY. Prashant, thank you very much for joining us. Just to recap, we've been currently focused on clause 2P and clause 2G, which is both the definition of telecommunication and the definition of messaging. But since you're joining the debate now, I want you to put it in context for our viewers. What is the top takeaway according to you in terms of this bill that you have really keenly looked forward to?
Yeah, thanks, Siddharth. Yeah, I think from a bill standpoint, it is going to lay the foundation for the next 3 or 4 decades for India to grow and to grow the telecom services. I think the earlier acts and changes and some of the notices or some of the amendments which came in were fairly old, but now with this bill coming in, it kind of lays the path for us. I think it is, it's got some very positive signals. Whether it's on the penalties, whether it's on the tiered dispute resolution, whether it's on the spectrum allocation on an administration basis for satellite companies, apart from some of the others that have been mentioned in the schedule, or whether it's on the use of the USO fund now, which has been renamed for Bharat Digital Nidhi, which is now for digital and for urban and for R&D. So I think, the sandbox approach on the regulation, I think it is fairly forward-looking and encourages a lot more innovation, R&D, and development of the sector in the country. Obviously, I heard the debate earlier on messaging and on the definition of messaging and on the definition of telecom services. I think that's a big debate. That's a matter of interpretation. I'm sure if on a back end all of this has to be authorized or registered, then it's going to be a Herculean task. But let's see how that pans out.
We'll come to that, but I want to take up the point that you mentioned and so did Jaideep. How significant is this decision to say that as far as satellite services are concerned, the spectrum is proposed to be allotted without an auction? Is this meant to sort of ensure faster and easier proliferation of these services? And what signal is the government trying to send through this measure?
Fairly good from a consumer standpoint, as well as from a spread of broadband, at least in the terrains where broadband cannot be provided either by getting fiber there or by getting, setting up 4G or 5G networks, which provide the user experience of the broadband speeds that one is looking at. So now with this, the spectrum not being auctioned and available on an administrative basis, the cost of providing that service will come down, and will also make it more affordable to the users. So one is the speed. Otherwise, we would have waited for the auctions to happen. The other one is the cost, because now it's all admin, and that cost, of course, gets transferred in the form of benefit to the user. So I think it'll create a faster broadband rollout to the households which are in the terrains where today fiber cannot reach. It could also go to the other parts of the country, not that it could be stopped, but at least in those terrains where fiber or 5G doesn't reach out, satellite could provide broadband. I think it's fairly important, Siddharth.
Prashant, how would, and this is a hypothetical sort of point at this stage at least, how would such spectrum be priced? Because obviously you will have to attach a value to it. It's nowhere being said that it will be given free. It's going to be without an auction, which sometimes lends to sort of too much bidding. But how would pricing be determined for satellite spectrum? Is there any reference globally?
I mean, globally, I believe these are all being given without any charges, Siddharth. Based on whatever we have seen, there's no charge for the spectrum in most of the markets. So ideally, it should not be without a charge. Even if you were to charge, maybe they put some kind of a revenue share onto it if it's administratively allocated. I mean, if you just go back, even when the admin allocation was being done on spectrum before the spectrum auctions happened, it was linked to the license fees, and then based on what you were taking additionally, there was a single charge which came in. I think it would be far more reasonable than going through the price of an auction, Siddharth. Okay. And it could be free as most of the markets have globally.
Absolutely. And when we put this question to people who have in the know of this entire process, what I got to understand was that perhaps the fine print on these aspects will come from the TRA's recommendations as and when this matter goes to them. But Jaideep, the larger point here, and I must also tell our viewers that there is a legal proceeding underway at the highest court, where this question of the previous ruling of the Supreme Court that all spectrum has to be auctioned, perhaps there will be some testing of this concept. This is not yet a law, so we'll wait for that to play out. But the broader question, could the government or should the government have considered going back to an omnibus convergence bill? I remember that was the first draft of that was put up in 2000-2001 during an NDA government itself. But the sense that I get is that 2 or 3 separate important bills which are work in progress at this point of time, and there are sticky issues around the kind that you mentioned. Would it have made sense to have one omnibus law?
It may have, but I'm quite fine with this approach where multiple regulations have been framed. One is the question of speed. How soon, as it is, we are replacing regulations which the earliest, is like 1950, which is whatever 70 plus years old, notwithstanding the modifications and amendments. So I think this approach is fine. The challenge, many of us have faced interpreting is that often there are overlaps amongst these, regulations, some part of the Ministry of Electronics and IT, some part of the telecommunications. And then as long as those differences are ironed out, so that from user in the sense, the service provider's perspective, they have a uniform view of what the regulation is across these 3, 4, 5 regulations, then that should be very, very helpful. At this point of time, there are areas where there's lack of clarity, and in terms of which service is governed by whom and which regulation would supersede the other one. So those are as it is, it's a convergence, what the point I was making. So it's very difficult to determine exactly because the services are kind of, overlapping across industries and sectors. What is a financial services or whether it's a tech company, what's online retail, these things are difficult. So I think this approach, to summarize, is fine as long as the overlaps are clarified. Essentially, the point I was making earlier also that needs to be very, very clear whether OTT is included in the telecom bill, and if which OTTs is WhatsApp included, is Paytm included, which is not into messaging business as a primary business. Those clarity will emerge, and as you said, those fine prints hopefully will emerge very soon.
Nikhil, one could also argue that in today's era, there is no such thing as a telecom network operator. It's actually all the networks are basically IP networks. Voice is also VoIP, and therefore that old regulatory or licensing approach is very old. The question therefore is, should there have been a de novo fresh exercise on these critical definitions as well?
No, absolutely. Like I said earlier, right, there needs to be a separation of content from carriage. So services need to be treated separately. Access services are separate, because if everything is IP, you're basically providing internet access. On top of that internet access, if there is something that's, if let's say Airtel's providing a voice connectivity service versus WhatsApp providing one, those services need to be looked at from an internet
Nikhil, but can I
perspective.
Nikhil,
Yeah.
just to interrupt you for the sake of clarity for our viewers, and we try and keep this show easy on the technical part. There is already a unified access service license.
Right, and so those are access services.
Right. So no, my argument is that if telecom as we license or authorize it currently, but there are so many apps which are not licensed. In fact, their jurisdictional.
But they're not providing access services, no, Siddharth. They're not providing access to the internet. They are on the internet, connecting one server from somewhere across the world to another user in this part of the country. They're not access services. So the data transfer services, which are what telecom operators are provided, need to be treated separately from services which are online services like voice, like video, like streaming services. Those are all internet-based services. So separate access services, which is like providing access to the internet, from online services separately. Because without access services, you can't use any online services in the first place.
Fair
and
point.
telecom operators which have spectrum are providing access services. One important thing I think which is not on the regulatory radar right now, but it needs to be addressed, is the market concentration of internet access. So I hope the opening up and the no auction approach to satellite communication will allow newer players to enter, because if you remember 10, 12 years ago, there were like 8 operators and more were looking to enter the country around the time the 2G scam took place. There is very little competition. There's just two,
Nikhil,
three players competing right now.
Nikhil,
I'm saying
on that aspect.
Just let me finish that. So what I'm saying is,
Sure. Please.
why is it that you have the same two dominant players on mobile internet access, the same two or three dominant players in terms of wireline access? Now you will have the same couple of players dominating satellite access as well. You need to have more competition, because the same players are entering multiple modes of internet access and dominating across domains. So a market concentration study to actually reduce this market concentration is necessary.
Fair point. What I was trying to intervene with, and I'll in fact take that question to Prashant. Prashant, in the satellite comm space, we know that as Nikhil put it, 2 of our dominant telcos already have plans. There are 2 companies overseas. One of them has a operational network called Starlink. There is another plan from Amazon, but as and when it gets the satellites up. And let me also inform our viewers here that sometimes comparisons are made with China. China has put up some 13,000 satellites alone for Satcom services, and we are still debating. So would it not be that for a Satcom service where the spectrum is allocated administratively, there will still be a requirement of a unified access service license? That requirement hasn't been done away with, Prashant.
Yeah, that requirement hasn't been done. So either you'll take a USL with IP, so internet service provider, or just providing internet services with a USL. So and you won't need the spectrum for it, but you'll end up paying the revenue share, Siddharth. So that's the way it would work, right? You can't provide that service without having a license to provide that service. And I mean, as I said, revenue share would be there, but you wouldn't incur the substantial cost of spectrum, which you buy on auctions, and therefore, hopefully, that service is going to be cheaper when it gets on to the consumers, which really depends upon how the administrative spectrum allocation is going to happen. But you would need a license, and most of the players who are venturing into the satellite services have applied for an internet service license under UL or ULVNO, whichever is the nature of the license that they've got.
What is the business case for Satcom services in India? Any numbers or details that you can share, Prashant?
I mean, I think it's very nascent right now, Siddharth. We haven't done any kind of study on it, but there's a lot of interest because there's a fair bit of unserved population. Now, with the cost, as I said, with the cost coming down, this could be fairly lucrative as a business.
Jaideep, there was quite some commentary about the power to take over networks, and for a moment I also thought that is this a new language or a new significant clause, because that seemed to dominate the headlines. I wonder if you have a view on the national security clause that continues even in this proposed law.
Yeah, only thing I have to say that, this lawful interception for national security, sovereignty and certain other conditions, unrest and things like that, those need to be there, because situation could be someday, unfortunately, and only in those conditions can government agencies, intercept. There is some, concern that, how this will actually get implemented. I have no comments on that, but except to say that yes, any such telecom regulations need to have those clauses giving the power to the government agencies to lawfully do the needful if situation arises. Now, in what situation such and such things may get actually, actioned, we do not know. So I will not speculate on that.
Nikhil, since we focused on 2P and 2G, how would you write this? What would be the solution? Because we can't have an omnibus bill. There are different things to be regulated, different technologies and different applications. How would you rearrange this to ensure that there is no overlap or confusion or lack of clarity?
Can I just comment on the lawful interception piece first?
Yeah, sure.
I think there is a significant need in this country for surveillance reform. And we haven't seen that, and the data protection bill also failed to do surveillance reform. The last known number from Parliament is that there were about 3,000 odd surveillance orders being issued every month. So the scale at which a centralized monitoring system is being used to do surveillance is quite expansive without any parliamentary oversight.
But Nikhil,
without any judicial oversight.
I have asked this question, and the response that we get is that one, look at the size of the number of telecom users, look at the size of population, and I feel that why would it be that big an issue if there is a national security challenge and
Correct.
It has to be dealt with? Why would
I don't disagree, but there is no legal definition of the word national security. There was and that is something even the Supreme Court today doesn't want to go into. That's what we saw during
But
the
it's the same
hearing.
Supreme Court that has pushed for interception. I mean, without going into
I'm
those
saying,
judgments.
I'm saying even the Supreme Court refused to get into issues of national security. But I think as a democracy, we need national security to be defined.
Okay.
There have to be and in fact there are ministers who privately have talked about a graded approach depending on the severity of the situation. What is the level of access that you give? And who is it that you give access to in those circumstances?
Okay.
Right now, it's just a free for all, and like I said, there are 3,000 orders being issued every month. That's a substantial number. Now, on your other question about
Okay,
changing
yeah,
the
because I'm running out of time. What needs to be
definition.
done to those two clauses to deal with the concerns
I think
from
that
your point of view?
I think there has to be a separation of content from carriage. A telecommunications bill should not regulate messaging. It should regulate spectrum, internet access, but not the services that are right on top of it. Those should be the remit of the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. The problem here is that they're trying to do both in this. And that's why you saw the broadcast bill also come from Ministry of Information and Broadcasting in a draft form, because there is a fear that this way the DOT will also take over regulation of broadcast. So I think the DOT didn't do adequate consultation. There wasn't enough transparency in how they've dealt with the comments that have come in, and therefore this I hope this bill doesn't get passed. To be honest, right? You can't have data, sound, video, text, whatever, which is on an internet network, being as a part of a telecommunications bill.
Okay.
If you want to do it for PSTN, sure, do it. But the internet is a separate beast altogether, and there are laws governing the internet, and this is only going to create conflicts between ministries, and no doubt this is going to go to court.
Okay. I want to take closing comments from both Prashant and Jaideep. Jaideep, coming to you first. And in fact, Nikhil, when we were also told that almost 1,000 hours plus of consultation has happened on this version of the bill. But Jaideep, the question to you, while we look at some of the headline grabbing items, on dispute resolution, a lot of disputes that have clogged the telecoms sector, and the point that is being made by the government is that there is now going to be a tiered structure where you can adjudicate disputes and not go the full legal battle every time. Is that significant?
Yes, it is. I mean, the telecom dispute and telecoms in India is a big thing, and it's like, over a period of time, various political connotations are already there, have been there. I think the tier structure is reasonably clear to me in terms of, for what penalties, for breaching terms and conditions, up to what level. Minor offense will, have this, and a severe offense will go up to this 5 crores. And then for user protection, I think that part is clear, and that's fairly significant. And if I club that with the user protection services, and as you were saying, other parts of the regulatory framework, the digital personal data privacy and hopefully Digital India Bill, I think the dispute resolution seems to be clear, and everything does not need to necessarily go to the long process of going through the courts, etc. So that I think I'm quite happy with the broad framework. So this is a broad bill. It's I think the details and those things will get worked out. But this part I'm quite looks like better. Having more clarity than what I started by saying, whether online services are excluded, included, which are included, excluded. That's not very clear to me. Siddharth.
Prashant, final word on the show to you, and this is to do with the impact some of these provisions. And remember, viewers, this is enabling legislation. A lot of the work will actually happen at the regulators level and at the level of the department. So we'll have to wait for that. But in corporate terms, what does this mean for our market, which has gone through a lot? We had multiple companies, they have shrunk. There are companies which have very significant debt burdens. Pricing for the customer has largely been well received, but what is the likely impact as far as the corporate part of India's telecom network is concerned?
Yeah, so Siddharth, I think the bill, as I mentioned earlier, is really forward-looking, and it is going to create the foundation for the evolution of the sector and the growth of the sector over the next few decades. I think if you look at the infrastructure as well, and I think we didn't touch upon that, ROW has become much simpler. It's being talked about in the bill. It has also been said that it is not to be considered, the telecom infrastructure or the digital infrastructure should not be considered as a property. That means that the property tax, the municipality tax, all that should go away from the telecom infrastructure, and that was adding on to cost compliances as well as uncertainty for the sector. I think the second part, of course, spectrum. Now all the spectrum has to be allocated on, or has to be given an auction other than the 15 which have been defined in the schedule. which also provides a certainty as to how the industry is going to shape up, and the spectrum is not going to be given administratively, would be good for anybody to come into the country and know that this is not going to change for the longest period of time. I think we talked about the other parts, which was with respect to the dispute resolution and the penalty coming down from 50 crores for every breach in every circle, right? So you had demands of 1800, 1900 crores for a simple breach. Now a breach can be classified and it could go maximum of 5 crores. That's a big relief. So I think all these elements, apart from that, the bill is focused towards innovation, focused towards R&D. For the first time, USO fund, which is renamed now Digital Bharat Nidhi, will be used for urban services as well. I think it's forward-looking. It is focused on innovation, focused on R&D, focused on doing new telecom services. And I think it's not just the corporates, the larger user base, entrepreneurship, and corporates. Everybody is going to gain from it. I think it's going to create more and more investments into the country. I don't know whether a new telecom operator would come in or not, but if you just look at globally, most of the markets have 3 or 4 telecom players and not more than that. So India obviously was an aberration that time with 8 to 10 telecom players. The market had to consolidate, and it did consolidate. So I think that's where we are, but this clearly lays down the foundation for the next couple of decades.
Absolutely. This is exercise that's been 14 decades in the making, and for the last 30 years when India's telecom services were opened up to private sector participation, we have seen a lot of ups and downs. This is one more milestone in the process of having a good structured regulatory framework, policy framework for India's telecom network, and by the numbers, it's clearly amongst the biggest as far as users are concerned. Nikhil Pava, Jaideep and Prashant, thank you very much for your time. We'll come back to this topic as news keeps developing. Until then, goodbye. You spoke about the demand for programming talent and the gap that exists, and also the impact of AI. This is primarily people who want to become managers, but what about the conversation that's happening in campuses all across the country right now? You know, placement season is not doing very well. IT industry, many companies have gone slow on fresh